Hey guys, welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Welcome to the Tuesday night live stream. Tonight, I've got a guest on here I'm incredibly excited to talk about. As you guys know, I've kind of mentioned it going back and forth. Church history is sort of my jam right now. I'm really loving it, kind of reliving it since college. And Keith Foskey here has a course that he presents through his church that he kind of goes through that. Now, some of the people watching this, Keith, may know you also for some other videos. So you want to kind of introduce yourself really quick and kind of just tell the people that might not know about you a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Keith Foskey. I'm the pastor of Sovereign Grace Family Church, but many people who are on Twitter or Instagram know me as the denominations guy because I do videos where I tease the finer points of denominational distinctions through humor. And I'm up to, I think, my 17th video now on what we call the denominational meetings, where it's various denominations getting together and having a conversation, and I'm playing the part of of each denomination. Some of them I'm a little bit harder on than others, and some I let be the heroes. A lot of Presbyterians think I'm Presbyterian because they often get to be the hero, but I'm actually not. I'm a Reformed Baptist. Our church holds to the 1646, the First London Baptist Confession. And so we are a confessional Baptist church, and I've been the pastor of the church going on to my 17th year as the pastor.
Wow, good deal. I don't know if you've seen them. I've seen some other people sort of take your idea and do it in their own as well. Like I've seen, I forget what her name is on Instagram has done that. And then there's been a couple Catholic done it too. But I do have to say, growing up in the Methodist church, your Methodist is right on. It is spot on. So
James White said I was going to become the official voice or the official face of the United Methodist Church, and that was never my intention. So,
well, good deal. So, going on to again, that a lot of people know about that, but when I was watching some of your videos, I don't know where it was because you kind of intersperse some of your sermon clips and some of your other stuff along with some of this online, and somewhere I had run across where you had mentioned a church history class that you guys offer through your church for free. That's like, I think, if I remember right, like seminary level. Is that correct or no?
well, it is, and that's kind of something we have what's called Sovereign Grace Academy, and we call it a seminary for everyone.
Okay.
And basically, what that is it is a seminary style class that we teach through the church. And it's actually a 2-year program. We have 8 core classes, starting with hermeneutics, and then survey of the Old Testament, survey of the New Testament, and survey of biblical doctrine. That's year 1, and then year 2 is church history, apologetics, Christian ethics, and then we end with Christian life and ministry, which is based on a book I wrote called The Biblically Functioning Church. And the whole 2-year program is designed to take a person into lay ministry. So if a person wants to be an elder in the church but isn't looking at being a vocational minister, this would be a perfect course for them to go through. If somebody's wanting to be a deacon in the church or even a Sunday school teacher, if you do the 2 years, it gives you a good solid foundation in the major points that Christians should know and understand. And that's what it was designed to be. And so is it seminary level? It's seminary type. I would say that our classes are shorter than what most seminaries do. We're only 8-week classes, and a lot of seminary classes are 12 and 16 weeks. So it's shorter. It's more it's more telescoped. There's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. We have a textbook that you have to read. We have tests that you have to take. And every course you do, you get a certificate of completion. After you do the 8 courses, you get a 2-year diploma showing that you've done the whole 2 years. So yes, that's the way we describe it. This seminary for everyone is the way we describe it.
Gotcha. So yeah, so if you guys are thinking about maybe doing something like that, right? You're like, hey, I don't have the money, I don't have the time, but they've made it available for you. Again, 2 years is a long haul, but really, when with what what you're talking about teaching through, That's incredibly necessary in regards to covering all the things you're going to cover. Now, obviously, you said the first year you kind of cover some more of the other stuff that's aside from church history, but as we've already talked about, like I really want to narrow into that tonight. So if people are interested in it, obviously they're going through the first year, they get into that second year of church history. I know, again, the class I just got through teaching at my church is probably nowhere close to what you've gone through, but I noticed when I was doing that, there was so much stuff that I was remembering from college, but a lot of people that had been in church their whole life, they just never heard before. And so if you can talk to that, maybe just the importance of us as believers, understanding where we came from and like some of the things that you've really found like people have found helpful in this course that maybe if people are like, I don't know if I want to do it. I don't know if I want to get into this thing, whether it be yours or just reading a book about church history. Like what have you found like the gold nuggets that have really helped people that you've talked to kind of, learn about our faith more?
Well, I'll start by telling it's a story I tell at the beginning of every history class, every church history class, and it's from Charles Schulz, the writer of the Peanuts cartoon. Remember Charlie Brown and
I
Lucy,
do. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
well, there's a great cartoon where one of the characters, one of the girls, I think it was his sister Sally, was writing a paper, and Charlie Brown says, "What are you writing about?" And she says, "I'm writing about church history." And he goes, "Oh, okay." Well, he walks away and it shows what she's writing. And her first sentence is, "My pastor was born in 1935." So, so I've always used that as the example that we as a people tend to be very invested in our own time, and we tend to anachronize our time into the past and think that the people who came before us lived like we do, think like we do, act like we do, when that's really not the case. And so one of the things that studying history in general does is it takes us to a different time in the past and shows us, hey, there was a time when many people never moved further than 25 miles from the place that they were born, that they never really lived outside of their own communities, that there was no such thing as global news, right? What was happening on the other side of the world was not even thought about, much less known about. And looking back at things like we think about COVID and our pandemic that we just went through. You go back to the Black Plague and the Black Death of Europe, and you see such a massive amount of death in a very short amount of time, and you can walk through that and say, what would it have been like to live then? And these are things that our ancestors experienced. Our ancestors lived that life and yet still remain faithful. And so there is a great wonder in looking back at the past and seeing what our ancestors were able to endure and yet remain faithful to Christ and to his gospel. And so there's a great encouragement in that, in pointing to those things and not being so tied up in the now. We all think, my brother Andy Montoro is one of my elders. He says we all think we're the tip of the spear. That's his favorite phrase. He said we always think we're the most important. We're the tip of the spear.
Mhm.
We're the end. And I think that's why every generation thinks their generation is going to see Christ return, because we all think we're it, right? This is it. This has got to be as good as it's going to get, or as best, as far as it's going to
Yeah.
go. But it's amazing what's come before us and what people have been able to accomplish for Christ in 2000 years. So that's my my encouragement to people for church history is you don't know what you're missing if you don't study these things.
Yeah, and going through, I mean, we spent probably a good portion of one of the nights going through and talking about, like what you said, just pointing out there's certain martyrs or certain saints of the faith, and being like, hey, I mean, you're not. First of all, you haven't gone through half of this that they went through, and two, you have great witnesses of the faith that have come before that you can look to and say, man, how, like you talked about with the Black Plague, like how did they deal with that? How did they process God being sovereign over all of this while they were seeing such a death rate in front of them, along with just all of these other events in history that happened. I think one of the ladies one night when we were teaching through it was like, man, if you see it from that 3,000-foot view, you can just see God's hand just working through the whole thing, working through evil kings to bring forth his goodwill, working through all of these different circumstances and really working it out. And like you said, so often we have just that little "are now," like, oh, this, oh no, this is the first time we've ever had to think about it. No, it's not. Like, it's happened before. And sort of on that note, I guess, in the line of this church history thing, one of the things that we really tried to kind of pull out in the short time that we had teaching through it was all of the heresies that have come before. As we taught through them, we're like, man, like literally nothing new under the sun. And so, like, how do you kind of, I'd be really interested in picking your brain since you've done this a number of times. Like, what are the things that you found the advantages of being like, all right, let's lay this out, let's teach this so that our people can kind of see this for what it is and see that it's already been dealt with before. Like, do you cover that much at all?
Yeah, in fact, the very first time I taught church history, and this has been before we started the academy, so this was maybe 10 years ago. I did my first, and it was on a Wednesday night. We did it as our Wednesday night Bible study, and I said I'm going to teach church history, and I chose to do it by teaching through the creeds and confessions of the church. And so going back to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and then the Chalcedonian Creed and the Athanasian Creed, and moving on, showing these different things all the way down to the Westminster Confession and London Baptist Confession and all these things. And my reason for doing that was that almost in every case, these creeds or confessions were there because a heresy had developed within the church, and the church had to answer that heresy by providing a sound biblical exposition as to what the Bible actually teaches about this subject. I mean, obviously, Nicaea is in regard to the Arians. Looking before that, we really don't have the Apostles' Creed is not, we can't point to anything specific, but what the Apostles' Creed does is it creates a firm foundation. Every Christian's going to believe these things, and if you don't believe these things, you're not part of the body, and so it establishes foundations upon which future generations would build, and clarifies issues. It's the you have the different factions that grow up. You have the Arians, and then you have the oh goodness, the Monophysites and different groups that have different views on the nature of Christ. And every time these issues are dealt with, it's nailing down even more specifically what we mean when we talk about the theanthropos, Christ being the God man. And what does that mean? Is he's fully God and fully man, two natures unmixed yet united in the one person of Christ. And so, you can use the first 4 centuries of the church as a Christological foundation, and do your Christology based on this is the battles they fought, and this is what they fought over, and this is why this matters.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that we mentioned while talking through them is, I mean, basically what you just said, like the good thing about heretics is that they force the church to be incredibly clear about what was already clear, but putting it down in writing and saying, okay, no, you're wrong. This is not how this works scripturally. This is not how, we have the clear teaching of scripture. And I think pointing back to those is incredibly important. One of the first things before we even got to the church history series, and I feel like like I repeated the path way after you, but we started with the Apostles' Creed before. I mean, last year we went through that before we even got to church history, and really just walking through and helping people see like all of the things that you're seeing online or in culture or within the church and all of its various like just things that are breaking out now, especially with a lot of with gender and sexuality and all those sorts of things can be combated with and dealt with what everyone before us has already said in regards with the creeds and holding to scripture as a firm foundation. And so when we got to the church history thing, and this is why I just keep pointing people to church history, is why like I wanted to bring you on so that people knew about your course, is because I feel like the more we know about what has come before, the heresies that have been fought, the creeds and confessions that have been written, and the more we catechize and disciple people, the less I have to worry about people going like, hey, so what do you think about this thing? Or what do you think about this news event? Like, you're equipping people by teaching them through it how to sort of have this lens to deal with it, and not, like you said before, have this microscopic lens, but really see it from this huge view and say like, hey guys, like this has happened before. Just just be aware of that, point to that, not, having to constantly run to your pastor and be like, hey, what do you think, man, about this thing? Like, about it. Yeah.
Exactly. And even I love what you just said about the having the broad view. I'm an outline guy where a lot of times I'll use our whiteboard and draw timelines, and I like to show things. And it's funny how you look at church history as a time, the first 500 years and then the next 1,000 years are known as what's typically known as the Middle Ages, and then you have the post Reformation era. If people just understood that, you have the early church, and then the after, of course, the Roman the ascendancy and the papal uh, uh, struggle for power, and those things that we see in bringing about the Middle Ages, and just those distinctions of time. And then of course 1056 with the or 1054 with the schism, the great schism, and breaking it up and seeing, okay, you know union and division and all these things. It's good to sit back and look at it as like you're watching a parade, but from on top of a skyscraper. You can see the whole parade, you can see the end where you are, you can see the beginning. And I think it's very helpful.
Yeah. So with that, right? So obviously you're teaching people this for a reason. Now you say, I mean, for the course you're teaching them how to be lay leaders in their church. But just as a general help, right? I mean, heresy hasn't stopped. Heresy hasn't ceased being taught. In fact, it finds new roads all the time. And so I'm just interested. Again, I know this is sort of off the cuff, so you may not have an answer right away. But with that being said, you're obviously on TikTok, you're obviously on Twitter, you're online, so you've probably seen a lot of the things coming up. What are some of the heresies that you see sort of coming up again that really, if people, again, know church history, know the past, see it? I love that analogy, seeing the parade from that skyscraper, and you just have to look back and go, "Oh, that was back here." Like we've already handled that. And then being able, instead of panicking about some TikTok theologian that's going off the handle and making it sound real great, they can just be like, actually, no, we've already talked about it. Is there any, maybe it's not, copy paste heresy, but maybe it's a piece of it that you maybe see coming back, that with your knowledge of church history, you're able to say, like, guys, this is just this whole thing rehashed over again?
Well, the one that we see every generation, it seems, have to deal with is the question of the nature of Christ's divinity and his humanity, and how those things are to be understood from a Christian perspective. Because when we think about, like, I don't know if you saw recently where Jeff Durbin and James White had the young man on their show, and he was supposedly a pastor who
Mm-hmm.
promotes homosexuality. Well, if you've ever listened to that young man, I can't think of his name right now, but I've seen him on TikTok as I put my
Brandon.
videos out. Okay, yeah, yeah. He not only promotes homosexuality, he also promotes a different Christ. He promotes a Christ who is not divine, a Christ who is a sinful man. He has said Christ is a sinner. He has said Christ is was a racist who had to repent of his racism. I wanted to vomit when I heard those words, because you're not only you're talking about my savior, you're also talking about the one through whom all things hold together. All in him all things were created, and in him all things hold together. And you're talking about the one who's literally causing your heart to beat, and you're calling this one a sinner. And so the nature of Christ, again, like I said, the first 500 years of the church, there was so much conversation about that. And it wasn't all Arianism. It had to do with his human nature as well as his divine nature. And how do we understand his mind and his will, and, those different things. And I admit to saying we are at times having to say, we don't know how everything works within the mind of God, and this is because it's like the Atlantic Ocean can't fit in a thimble, neither can the mind of God fit into my finite mind. And so I have to consider that and say, I can only know what I can know, but the church has given me 2,000 years of history to help me know what I can know.
Mm-hmm.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Well, yeah, and that's I don't know what Brandon says anymore because Brandon blocked me. But yes, I did
Oh,
see those videos. I did definitely see
yeah.
those videos. But and like you said, I think that's the incredibly important part is knowing what the church has handed down to you. The more I've studied church history, the more I mean, again, we were taught it in college, so it's just a matter of sort of a refresh over and over again as you need to. But you, if you don't know that you've been handed so much work has already been done for you. Like it's not that you have to go rediscover the wheel. The work has already been done for you. If it's been handed to you, just here, read, understand, enjoy. And knowing that takes a huge weight off of your shoulders of like this is what has happened before, understand it. And like you said, you're going to continually have these heresies come back up. The one you mentioned happens all the time. I think one of the most eye-opening things for me is when the Ligonier report comes out all the time, and it's like, hey, these are the things that the church says. Yes, we agree that he is fully God, fully man. Some people don't. I mean, and just those percentages going back and forth. So with that, right? Saying, I know you have a TikTok about this, but let's say somebody can't take your course, right? They're like, man, I'd love to, but 2 years is a lot. I don't know if I can dedicate all that time. What are some resources that you're like, all right, cool, but these are the things that I would highly recommend? Like you sit down, once a night and just read through this. That's going to help you a ton. Like, what are your top 4 that you'd recommend to people?
Well, let me just one thing take a step back very quickly because the
Okay.
other thing one of my resources is going to talk to this specifically, and that is the other issue that comes up with almost every generation is the battle for the Bible, the truth, veracity,
Yeah, for sure.
and reliability of the text. Ever since the Enlightenment, we have seen this onslaught of whether or not the Bible's true, whether or not it can be trusted, whether or not what it says is accurate to history, and what it says about God, is it historically true and accurate? So if I were going to tell somebody, here are some resources, on church history, our the book that we use for our class is Bruce Shelley's Church History in Plain
Mm-hmm.
Language,
Yeah.
and some people really say, well, that one's too, it's they point to other resources that are more reformed, because Bruce Shelley's book is not necessarily reformed, and me,
Mm-hmm.
of course, I'm a conversation with a Calvinist. People know
Yeah.
I'm reformed, so people will say, well, why don't you point to this one, this one is more reformed, and I say, well, Bruce Shelley is digestible for the average person. He can be read by just about anybody who has a decent reading level, can follow along and learn, and he doesn't seem to be coming from a particular perspective. He gives due credit to Catholics when Catholics get it right. He gives due credit to Orthodox when the Orthodox get it right. But he still says, well, this is where Protestants would disagree with this, or Roman Catholics would disagree with that. So I think he's fair. And there is it, but there is something about it I want to mention.
Okay. There's a
From
there's
what
a big
from,
but here. There's a caveat.
Yeah, and don't want to take too much time. I know you asked for me for 4, and I'm talking about the
Oh,
first one so
you're
long,
good.
but
You're good. Go for it.
well, there's a 5th edition that came out of his work, and from what I understand, it was after his passing, and I think that it was his daughter had influence on it. And again, I'm not saying anything about her because I don't know her. I'm basing this on the reviews that I've read and things that I've seen. We used the 4th edition in my class. The 5th edition, some of my students had to get it because it was the only one that they could get through the source that they had, and it does have inclusions of things that address more modern issues like wokeism and stuff like that, which I don't know the direction it takes. So
Okay.
I say I have not read the 5th edition. I don't know what all it says about the more modern issues,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that the previous editions were fair, so I can hope that it is as well. But that's I can't give a complete, you know,
Yep.
stamp of approval.
Keith saying,
So
get the old one. Go to an old
well,
bookstore.
we use the 4th edition because that's the one I have and that's one
Yeah.
I've read, and we use it, and I found it to be helpful. Read it several times. Um, the second work that I would recommend, and this may seem like way off the topic, but I would recommend Michael Kruger and The Question of Canon.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I'm sorry. Canon Revisited.
Hmm.
There's two books that he has, but both of them are great. Canon Revisited talks about the nature of the canon, and the question of canon talks about why we should have a canon in the first place. And this gets to the second issue I was talking about, is the issue of scripture. How do we know? Because the big question that people are asking today is not whether or not the Bible's true, but how do we even know this is the Bible? How do we know that these 66 books are the right ones, that these 66 books are actually what God intended us to have? How do we know that the Gospel of Thomas doesn't belong in here?
Yeah.
And there are people who believe.
Everyone found out about the Gnostic Gospels, and they're like, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think Michael Kruger is the leading man in this area to give a conservative biblical response to those questions. And the question of canon is actually one of the books that I'm recommending for my next course, which is starting this Sunday, and it's on the how we got the Bible, which is it's a different it's our apologetics course, because our apologetics course typically comes down to defending the God of the Word, or the Word of God. And so knowing where the Bible came from gives you a firm foundation upon which to defend that word. And so we're doing 8 weeks on how we got the Bible. We're using Neil Lightfoot's book, How We Got the Bible, as our textbook. But I always have in our syllabus, I always have the textbook, and then I have the recommended readings. And the recommended readings for this class include Kruger's books, as well as James White's books, Scripture Alone, and the King James Only Controversy. And so those are just books that are helpful in regard to the history of the text and how the text has
Yeah.
been transmitted. So that's two. You asked for four, so I'm I'm thinking. And did you want them all to be historical, or did you
Well,
just
I
say four
mean,
things
just
people?
I mean, I like where you're going with the direction of the how we got our Bible thing too. I think again that's important. If you have another one on that, like I've got Ryan Reeves how we got our Bible, and that was helpful as
Mhm.
well for me. But I think that, again, like you said, the two almost go together. If you're going to cover church history, like you said, you're going to cover the canon. So really, anything in that direction, I think, would be incredibly helpful to people. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you another resource that most people don't even probably they might even laugh that I say this. But are you familiar with Rose Publishing?
No, I don't think I've heard of it. No.
Well, back when Lifeway was alive with its stores, before it was just an online thing, Lifeway had stores that you could go and sit in and actually read their books and buy books. And back
A
in the Stone
physical
Age.
location?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And my wife and I used to, that was date night for us. We would go eat dinner, and then we would go to Lifeway, and I'd go sit and read a book while she walked around and looked at books, and picked out one for herself to buy, and I'd buy me one or whatever. And we loved it. It was one of our favorite places. Even though Lifeway, the level of scholarship usually wasn't very high, you could find nuggets on the shelf. But anyway, Rose Publishing publishes charts and all kinds of visual aids to Bible study. And they have now created a book. It's about that thick, and it is all of the charts that they have done. It's called the Rose Book of Charts, and it has everything from full color diagrams of the the tabernacle in the wilderness, Moses and the tabernacle. It's got full color diagrams of that. It's got full color charts of church history, and who were the major players at different times. It's got an entire little section on how we got the Bible, which is pretty decent. I actually have it as one of the recommendations for this class, because it does have a visual aid of how we got the Bible, starting from the writing on stone, and then writing on parchment and vellum and papyrus, and how that became codices, and how codices became books, and how those things changed down through the ages. And for people like me, who tend to enjoy the visual, who tend to enjoy something they can see. And so again, it may not be for the high scholars out there, it may not be something that you are interested in, but for somebody like me, I can take those pictures and learn a lot from those visual images. So the Rose Book of Charts
Okay.
is, I use it.
Sounds to
And
me like
what's
I need to pick that up because I am 100% a visual learner. I would have done way better in school if somebody would have showed me instead of made me write it. Yeah.
And what's great is it says it on there. It says reproducible. You are allowed as a teacher to photocopy pictures out of the book and hand them out to your class. As long as you're not selling the reproductions, it is a reproducible book. Rose Publishing really put a lot of thought into this when they produced this book because it's for teachers. And
That's
so
a
if you
solid, yeah.
yeah, you being a teacher, I would definitely recommend you getting it. And again, not everything in it is gold. There's some stuff, you might say, I don't, this isn't the best, but as a resource, it's a very good resource. And lastly, if you're a student of the Bible, you should also be a student of theology. And so I would say you need to have some book on your shelf that is causing you to think through the theological systems of Scripture. And the one we use for our overview of systematic theology, which is again, it's only 8-week course, so it's very short, but we use R.C. Sproul's "Everyone's a Theologian" because it's easy, it's accessible, it's readable by anybody with a generally good reading level can get through it in the 8 weeks. And you'd have to read the book in 8 weeks, so that's part of it. If you want something deeper than that, you can always go to Boyce, or you can go to something deeper, even some of the more very, very, scholarly. You can get Calvin's Institutes if you want to. But if you're looking for something to flip through, like you said, at night, reading one, you can read a chapter a night. They're only 2-3 page chapters. You can read a chapter a night and get through the whole book relatively quickly. So those are four that I would say for the average person be really helpful.
Awesome. So all of this, as we've kind of hinted at a little bit, but I think I would get a little bit more specific here, because what I found is, obviously, so there's a ton of church history to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be places that you're going to have, some people are going to have to move slower through. Some people are going to need the charts. I love the chart idea. I'm definitely a visual learner. The chart idea is going to be for some people. Some people are going to want that big, thick theological book. But what I found is, as we move through teaching through it, as I kind of reintroduce myself again to it, there are certain stories that are just so inspiring, so helpful, that really just remind you of how God's good work, how He just works through people and through history. And I know this is sort of spur of the moment, but like, as you've obviously explored it a lot, you've taught through it a ton. Are there a couple stories or a couple moments in church history for you that like are just special to you? Like, you just get there and you're like, man, this is my jam. This right here, this story, like, is just one that brings life, that just reminds me of God's goodness, reminds me of the saints persevering. Like, do you have one of those that you're just like, every time, this is it right here?
Yeah, and I hope there's not, somebody might call me out for my accuracy here because I'm not sitting in front of my notes. So I'll give it as best as I can.
Yeah,
But if
I always
I'm,
use that caveat too. I'm like, guys, I don't have it memorized. Yeah.
but I think about the when Charlemagne was given his crown by the Pope, because what was happening in that moment was a demonstration of papal authority over the crown, because the one who sets the crown has the authority to do so. And by setting that crown, because what happens, Charlemagne comes in to receive Holy Communion, and he's receiving it from the Pope. And the Pope produces a tiara, a crown, and he lays it on his head, showing his authority over the empire. And when he does that, it's well recognized that he's showing he had the authority to do that. And this is one of the problems that we see in the medieval church, is where the first 500 years of the church, well, maybe say first 400 years, it was a fight for existence, and then the next 1,000 years was a scramble for power. And in that scramble for power, we see these incidences where there were these outrageous moments of papal misuse of power. Another one, there was a pope who exhumed the body of a previous pope, had the body put on display so that he could uh, condemn that pope as a heretic. But he was dead. He was already dead, and he was condemning his corpse, and in that moment demonstrating the futility of this scramble for power. And then we have the men like Wycliffe and Huss, who dared to challenge that power, who dared to stand against what was being taught. And Wycliffe, particularly teaching against transubstantiation, was challenged for doing so. And he said, but this is nouveau doctrine. This is new. This has not been around. Because transubstantiation as a doctrine, even though real presence had been believed for a long time, the idea of transubstantiation, Christ's sacrifice being represented for the sins of the people, was a relatively new doctrine, within a couple hundred years at the time of Wycliffe. And he stood against that, and being willing to stand against that power. And then of course Jan Hus, and then both of them were condemned at the Council of Constance. John Huss was burned, but because Wycliffe had died, they had to exhume his bones and burn his bones, and they cast them into the River Swift. So I guess I'm kind of truncating a lot of stories here, but the point I'm saying is, with the rise of power brought the rise of corruption, and yet God's gospel was able to be it was able to overcome that. And the gospel was never lost, even though it was shrouded in darkness. The gospel was still there. Men and women were still being saved. There were still saints in the Middle Ages who were doing great things for the kingdom. But God used men like Wycliffe and Huss, and then of course the venerable Luther, to stand against that corruption, and say, we're not doing this anymore. So I hope that's makes sense. But yeah, I
No,
like to just sort of, yeah.
yeah, it does. And I think one of the things there that, again, going back, I mean, again, looking at it from the skyscraper and the parade view there, I think that helps us often to then say, okay, well, how do I then, knowing how these saints have lived before me, knowing how they have functioned in this particular instance against corruption and against power, how do I therefore then process, maybe using them as examples, to do the same thing? And I think that's where church history not only becomes like interesting intellectually, but also applicable in a very real way, no matter where you're at in time, no matter what, culture you're in. The reality being, like, this isn't just a thing that, that they applied. It is an applicable thing today, to where even now, I mean, you were talking about it, I think there's definitely sort of pieces of that still around, in the sense that obviously it's sort of kind of coming out in a different way. But this, again, this grasp for power, and how then do we as believers react to this, function amongst that? And a lot of it, I think, comes from, again, obviously being in the Word, but looking at those that have come before us that have had to deal with very similar situations. But we only know that, again, if we know the history we come from. Do you have anything to maybe add to that, or no?
Yeah, and we're in a much different contextual situation. We talk about like power. We're in a situation now where we while the Roman Catholic Church still exists, it's certainly not the world power that it once was. And so what powers are we now facing that are calling for us to abandon fidelity to the scriptures? Is it not even within our own world, our own government, that we see the call to abandon fidelity to Christ and replace that with faithfulness to something else? And so, yeah, I mean, seeing our ancestors stand against the tyranny of the papal system should cause us, especially those who call ourselves Protestants, to have that same motivation to stand against whatever other tyrannies. If the government says, you can't gather, well, our Protestant ancestors were told, you can't gather. I mean, at the threat of being burned at the stake. Again, Jan Hus was burned at the stake because he dared question the authority that was over him. And are we willing to? And I tell you a quick story. This reminded me of a story just now. My wife and I were watching a film, and she often reminds me of this because it was a story of of a Christian pastor in Russia during a time where there was a Russian persecution of Christians. And I don't remember when the history was. I just watching the movie, I remember this moment because there was a moment where there was like a city council meeting and no one would stand up and speak truth. No one would speak against what was happening. And his wife said, "You need to speak." And he turned to his wife and he said, "If I speak, you won't have a husband anymore." And she said, "I would rather not have a husband than have a husband who's a coward." And my wife looked at me and I looked at her, and just in that moment we thought, that may be us one day, where you have to say the truth even at the threat of a sword, even at the threat of imprisonment, even at the threat of, oh my heavens, unpopularity. We may
Oh
have
no.
to speak. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? How
Mhm.
many men shirk from the truth because it's unpopular? How many more will shirk from the truth when it's deadly?
Mhm.
And seeing those men stand gives us the confidence to stand.
Yeah.
So that's a
Well,
thought.
I mean,
Yeah.
talk about a good wife there. Holy cow. I mean, just
Oh
yeah.
wow. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the helpmate of being like, I didn't marry no spineless dude. You better say something. Yeah.
That's
Well,
right.
and I know we're kind of wrapping up here, coming on the tail end of this. I mean, you telling that really reminded me of this within church history, and then we can kind of tie up the end here. But one of the things that I found really super interesting, sort of in relation to your story, is that during the Diocletian persecution, that last big one of the things, and it came up, I guess, in the previous ones as well, but it was very present there, if I remember correctly, was that the whole point was that, like, all you have to do is eat the meat, man. Just eat the meat, sacrifice to idols. That's all we're asking, and then you can go. That's all you need to do. And all of these believers refusing to do that, because Jesus was more important than that. It was more important than their titles, their land, their lives. All of that was more important. And I remember when we were going through that, like, I don't think that a lot of us within, like you said, like within America, have really thought about that process before, of like, what are you willing to lose for Christ? And behind all of that persecution, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, a lot of it came to the fact that the Roman Empire had really come to the conclusion that the reason bad things were happening in the empire is because the Christians were not participating in sacrificing to the other gods. And all we had to do was get the Christians to participate, and then all of the bad things would go away. But until they did that, it was going to keep being bad. So Christians, you're the issue. You're the reason all of this bad thing is happening. And if you just sacrifice to the gods and make them happy, that's all we're asking. And I remember just thinking through it, and I'm not saying it's a copy paste, like, direct correlation, but when we're talking about, like, hey guys, just sacrifice to the modern gods and you're fine. Just sacrifice to them. Just all you got to do is say the one thing, eat the one thing. That's all you got to do, and you'll be fine. And I think in a very much like less way, Christians are really having to think through that process a bit more now, of like, what are you willing, again, is unpopularity, maybe a job, on other things. And I think going back to the church history thing, knowing where you came from, knowing what people have sacrificed before, knowing that really history just sort of repeats itself again, you have not only the knowledge of what might come, but how to react. And you have saints of the faith that have come before that have really shown you the way of how to be faithful in times that, you never thought maybe would happen. And it always comes down to, I just thought it was so simple, of all you have to do is eat the meat. That's all we're asking. And when you don't do that, more, worse things occur. And I think
Yeah.
knowing church history really helps us be prepared in our day for those sorts of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, you don't want to draw an analogy too close, but it's hard
Yeah.
not to remember people saying things like, "Well, all you got to do is stop meeting publicly. Why don't you meet online? Why is that a problem? It's the same." All you got, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? These are
Yeah.
things that we've been told. And how many church leaders were, yeah, it's the same. Just meet online. It's the same. You know what these guys are doing right here. This is church, and we
Yeah.
can have a Zoom meeting and we can call
Take
it
a
church.
Gatorade and a Dorito. That's your communion,
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah, and that's the way it comes across. And what's funny is what you mentioned is Christians were if I remember correctly, were actually referred to as atheists because
Yeah.
they would not worship the pantheon of gods, versus they would say, Caesar's not Lord, but Jesus is Lord. Kaiser Kurios, no Jesu Kurios. The we People don't mind if you worship Jesus as long as you're willing to worship other things too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the yeah.
Awesome. So as we sort of wrap up here, just sort of ending, kind of let people know, obviously you've named a lot of references. I'm going to try to put those in the description below. But if people want to kind of follow you online, get to know you a little bit more, obviously you have a sprinkling of a lot of different things, which is what I appreciate. It's not just funny Keith. It's not just serious. Like, here is my whole personality online. Where can they follow you and kind of get to know you a little bit more?
Well, Twitter is become kind of a fun place to go, and I do check Twitter quite a bit. So if people want to interact with me, at Your Calvinist on Twitter would probably be good. That's the way I think you and I
Yep.
interacted and talked. So at Your Calvinist on Twitter, people can look, if they're on Facebook, we have a Conversations with a Calvinist Facebook group that people can join. And that's where a lot of ideas for shows, people will ask questions and ask me to address a topic on the show. So Conversation with a Calvinist on there. If you're interested in the Academy, I would recommend going to our church's website, and that is sgfcjax.org, Sovereign Grace Family Church, sgfcjax.org, and JAX for Jacksonville. And when you go there, you'll see that it has a listing for Academy, and that will tell you about the 2-year program. Now, if you want to join the Academy, we have our own Moodle site, which is sort of like Blackboard. It's actually a classroom site that you have to join and create a username, and that's sovereigngraceacademy.org. But I recommend going to the church site first, read about the program before you go to the Moodle site, because the Moodle site is going to want you to create a username and all that. And unless you're ready to do that, I would go to the other one first. But those are the best ways. People can email me directly at calvinistpodcast@gmail.com. That's another way. Some people still send emails. So, it's not the most common anymore, but if people want to email the show, they can email calvinistpodcast@gmail.com.
Awesome. Good to know. Good to know. Yeah, guys. So there's a whole lot more that he does, obviously, than just this academy. But yes, definitely read about the academy before you dive in. You're not going to just jump into the deep end of the pool before you know how deep it is. Exactly. Good deal. Well, Keith, thank you for making the time to come on. I appreciate it a ton. I really appreciate just the scope of things you're doing, everything you've named there. There's a lot of time invested, a lot of information that you're giving back for the body to build them up, to educate, to help. And all of that, I think, just helps us grow more as believers and ultimately, like we've talked about a few times, interact with the society around us in an effective way. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much, man.
Amen. And thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Guys, if you appreciated this, you know somebody that might want to be interested in this, make sure you like it, share it, comment, all the cool things, and we'll see you next week. See ya.